Okay, good morning, everybody. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hello. Good. We'll wait for a minute and then we'll begin. Good afternoon to those people in Kigali and Doha. Good evening, is it? Okay.
Good afternoon, Prof.
What is the time there in Kigali?
It's 2:59 p.m.
3 p.m. All right. And 4 p.m. for the folks in Doha. Okay. And it's 6:30 for me here. All right. It's still, we have a minute to go. We'll wait a bit. We should have 350 people in class. So, assuming that some people are in bad time zones, we should nevertheless have about 250 people on Zoom. I'll wait for a minute more, half a minute, and we'll begin. Okay, let me begin. So before I begin, first I want to let you know that this class is generally very interactive, particularly when we do this on Zoom, because you can use the chat. And so feel free to ask questions, feel free to, just comment, have fun. And you're welcome to interrupt. I may ignore your interruptions, but feel free to speak. All right, so let us begin. Welcome to the Spring 2025 edition of IDL. And hopefully by now, you have already seen the logistics post on Piazza. And we have posted a lecture 0 also on logistics and other details on the website. So if you have not seen it already, please do so at once. The course website, for those of you who have not yet gone there, is deeplearning.cs.cmu.edu. Very easy to remember. Please visit it at once because almost all the latest information about the course, including the latest slides, deadlines, calendar, everything is on the course page. Now, the course objectives, logistics, quiz and homework policies, and grading policies all have been explained in both the logistics lecture, lecture 0, and on the course page. So do familiarize yourself because the course is going to be roughly based on these ideas on this rubric. Although we retain the right to change these things as required if it becomes necessary to do so. Also, you should already have signed on to Piazza. And you should have verified that you have access to Canvas and AutoLab. If you have not yet verified this, please do so at once. And there should already be a note on forming study groups. If you haven't seen it yet, please check. You will be required to fill a form. We encourage you to form study groups. And those of you who cannot form study groups on your own, we will set you up with a study group. Because we've found that the students learn much better when you work together than when you work by yourself. So collaboration is highly recommended in this course. Now, our course philosophy is we want no student to be left behind. In our ideal world, every one of you would earn an A. Now, again, the key is earn. The grades in this course are not easy. Yet, typically about 70% of the students get some version of an A. And that's not because we give out easy grades, but because we work extremely hard to make sure that all of you actually complete the course successfully, because your success is also our success. That you learn what you're supposed to learn, and that at the end of the course, you're as close as we can make you to being really good at practitioners of IDL, and also to some extent that you have a fairly good handle on the theory. We have lots of resources. We have more than 20 TAs. Please use them. We will set you up with study groups, and each study group will have a mentor. So again, take advantage of this. We have a TA in each of our campuses. So we have a TA in Silicon Valley. We have a TA in Doha. We have multiple TAs in Kigali. So you should have local support. Each of the TAs holds 2 office hours at least every week. Take advantage of that. And then, of course, I'm always available. I'm currently away, I'm in India. So I'm always happy to talk to you folks over Zoom or any other medium. And when I'm in the US, my office door is always open. You can always just walk in. Also, speak to your friends, speak to your classmates. The objective of the course is to learn. If you come here to this course to earn a grade, you're in the wrong place. You come to Ideal to learn deep learning. And so if you keep that as your focus, if you keep that in mind, everything that you do will be right because you will be trying to learn. Now, there's a lot of work in the course. You're going to find yourself dealing with stress. So if you're under stress or you're unable to perform or you're just generally feeling down about your performance in the course or about anything else, reach out to your TA mentor and or reach out to me and we'll do the best we can to help you. Also on this Saturday, the 18th, we have a meet and greet plus a lab plus a hackathon. We have hackathons on most Saturdays where we feed you pizza. And you just come there and you can work together. We will have TAs monitoring it. And the idea is that if you get together for a few hours, you'll get a lot more done in 2 hours of concerted effort with your friends than if you sit by yourself, holed up in your dorm room or wherever. And so we provide this venue where you can collaborate and you can get things done. So since this will be the first hackathon, this is also your opportunity to meet your colleagues, make some friends, form study groups if you don't already have one, and so on. And in this particular hackathon, it's also our first lab. We will teach you how to get started with deep learning code. So be sure to attend because this is a proper lab where you will have hands-on instruction on how to get started. Now for the course objectives, by the end of the course, you should be able to understand some of the theory behind deep neural networks. You should also be able to build your own neural network components and tools. And you should be able to work on large-scale problems. And the course has been designed and set up to achieve these objectives. So when it comes to understanding the theory, we're going to try to explain the what, the why, and the how, basically the math, and the occasional history. Now, knowing this also helps you contextualize how you use deep neural networks, bullets 2 and 3 below. And understanding some of the theory is actually really good for if you are interested in research, if you're interested in going on to grad school. And these are also the questions that get asked at job interviews. Second, your homeworks come in 2 parts. Now, the part 1 of your homework is designed or set up so that you will all be creating your own neural network toolkit. By the end of the semester, you can validly claim that you have built your own toolkit from scratch. So this won't be PyTorch. This will be something that you have built. So if you solve all the part 1s and all the bonus problems, this will be the outcome. And the third part of the course is where you work on large-scale problems. These are part 2s of your homework, where you will be competing with your colleagues on some state-of-art problems on Kaggle. So hopefully when you get all of these done, you become expert by the end of the semester. You'll also be working on a course project which can relate to any of these 3 points. And this, for those of you who actually stay with the course, this is my assurance, you would never have learned as much over a 100-day period as you will in this course. This is going to be the maximum amount of learning you will do in such a short time in your life, for most of you. Now, my lecture style is very verbose. Given the option of throwing a couple of equations at you or showing you lots and lots of pictures, I will show pictures. So which means there are many, many slides and lots of animation. And this also is not all, given a choice between deriving an equation symbolically and explaining it with 30 slides of pictures and animation, I'll go with the pictures. This works for most people, but not everybody. If this is not your idea of a good lecture, then you're not going to enjoy these lectures. I'm letting you know. Now, attendance is mandatory. You have a small amount of attendance points, 1 point out of 100. But then, as it turns out, that 1 point can be the difference between a B plus and an A. So A minus. So you probably don't want to lose it. We're going to use the in-class polls for class participation. And on Zoom, Zoom also tells me who is attending. But through the class, we will be posting polls in each lecture. The polls will be either on Zoom or posted on Piazza, and you must respond to all polls. We don't score you on correctness, only on whether you responded. Now, not everybody can attend because of live, because of time zone issues, and some of you will have other exceptions. Maybe you're sick, maybe you have a competing class. Those of you who have such conflicts must reach out to us, me and the TAs, and you will be granted permission to watch the recorded videos for the lecture instead. All of these videos will be recorded, all the lectures. They're going to be put up on MediaTek and on YouTube, and you may watch those lectures. And we can gather attendance from MediaTek, not YouTube. But if you watch your the lectures on MediaTek, we can gather your attendance from them. Now, last but not least, this is an interactive class. We like questions. And it's my firm belief that there's no such thing as a silly, wrong, or embarrassing question. So if you have a question and you feel shy to ask because you think maybe you haven't understood, or maybe you think you're exposing yourself, trust me, you're not. There are 350 people in class. If you have a question, without a doubt, there are a whole lot of other students in class who have the same question and who probably are feeling just as embarrassed as you and are reluctant to ask. So never hesitate about asking questions, because that's how we learn. Also, there's a natural reluctance to interacting. So I'm going to try different tactics. I might call out to random students by name. In different semesters, we've tried other kinds of methods, like giving you nicknames and calling out nicknames. Whatever it is, please participate. And yeah, this is the dumb classroom, which means that when you're in class, class is all you attend. Your phones and laptops must be shut. And except to follow the lecture on Zoom. And when I'm conducting the class in person in the lecture hall, then you may keep your laptop open to answer polls and view lecture slides and maybe take notes, but for no other purpose. You must keep your laptop shut and your phones must be turned off and upside down. Do not get distracted. If you feel like getting distracted, especially in the classroom, leave the classroom, go outside, finish your job, and come back. Because when you are distracted in class, it's not just you who is distracted. All the people around you are also being disturbed by your activities. And this has a ripple effect. And something, unfortunately, that I must inform you about, I'm physically handicapped. My back and neck are bent. I can't raise my arms. On some days, I can't walk. And I have breathing problems because of my neurological disorder. This means I have all kinds of weird mannerisms, and sometimes I need help from my TAs, like to clip on my mic. I use all kinds of strange devices to point because they are light, and that's how I can point to things on the board. If these things disturb you, I'm sorry, I can't help it. This is how it is. Please be kind. And so with that said, I'll wait for a minute for any questions. Any questions? Questions, anybody? No? Okay. So the slides we have here, I have 114 slides. I won't be going through all of them. I will be going through a subset. But so many of the slides are hidden, but all of the slides will be posted on the course website. Quiz questions will often refer to slides that are not presented in class, but are nevertheless part of the slide deck. So it is upon you to download the slides and actually go through the slides before you answer your quiz, because the information on the hidden slides is often important. That's why it's there. The reason I'm not presenting it in class is because we won't have enough time to cover everything that we want to cover. And so let me start. Again, I pause for a second. Questions? No. Can you confirm that you can hear me?
Yep.
Yes, sir. Yes.
And so good. And Ibrahim, to answer your question, you will get attendance points for watching the recording. Yes. So today we're going to go. This lecture is going to be a bit heavy on history, but it's important to okay, for those who are on wait list, if you're in section B, we are going to try to get all the section B students cleared. Section A's cannot be expanded because section A depends on the size of the classroom. Section B is virtually unlimited. And if you're in section B and not in the class, then unless you have too many credits or you have other conflicts, you will make it to class. Any other question? No? Okay. So today we're going to go through a brief history of neural networks. Section C is the equivalent of, honestly, I'm not even sure why we have a section C. We have a C and a D, but I think C is the in-person class, in which case you must be on D. And again, anybody can come to the classroom. The distinction between section A and section B is merely because the classroom is limited in size. But as far as in-person attendance is concerned, if you're the first person in the classroom, you stay. Right? So, and yes, all the additional materials will be questioned in the quizzes. Okay.
Excuse me, Professor.
Yes.
Hi. I just had a doubt. There's a section M as well. So does it mean it's the
Section,
same as
okay, section M. So because these are now this online sections have a problem that as an international student, it may not actually satisfy your requirement for in-person attendance. And so you're allowed to have one online section per semester, I think.
Okay.
And the professional master's programs almost all of them have one mandatory online course, which means that they cannot actually take up ideals. So for them and them alone, we've set up a section where they nominally attend lectures, 1 out of 6 lectures or 1 out of 5 lectures, and we have agreements with the department heads, and that counts for in-person attendance as far as the immigration folks are concerned. And so that's what section M is there for.
Okay, so should I register for class section A then? Because I'm an international student and I'm
Section B,
eligible.
if you don't have a second conflicting online class, then section B is just fine.
Okay, got it. Thank you so
Right.
much.
It's just that, some of them have this other mandatory class, which they cannot
Okay.
avoid. So section A, Dean, no, section A is full. So I would recommend that you guys actually move to section B and we'll clear that, definitely. All right,
Professor, thank you so much.
Let me continue with the class, right? So we're going to be starting with a brief history of neural networks. Aditi, yes, I mean, your study group can be a project group. It can also be different. It's up to you. So we'll start with a brief history of neural networks, talk about connectionism, its relation to cognition and the brain, and early models and their limitations. And we'll be introducing modern neural networks and what they can compute. That's the syllabus for today's class, right? And one last question. So Kwaku, the section B showed TBA, but it's the same time as section A. That's just S3, right? That's just SIO. So here's what we're here for. We all know that neural networks have basically taken over AI, right? We've applied them. You're seeing them all around you. They've been successfully applied to every kind of pattern recognition, prediction, and analysis problems. We may be at the cusp of AGI. And in essence, these neural networks have established the state of the art in effectively every problem, from math to physics to you name it, right? And in every case, when they establish the state of the art, they don't just establish the state of the art, they exceed previous benchmarks by enormous margins. And sometimes they've solved problems that you could not solve using previous methods. So, here are some examples. If you actually trace the history back, we have been working on artificial neural networks for, can anybody guess how long? How long have you been working on artificial neural networks? Anyone?
40 to 60 years.
40 to 60 years, 20 years, 50 years, 30 years. Okay, I'll get to that in a few minutes, right? Let me just say a very long time, okay? And for the longest time, nothing useful was, I mean, we had a toy system, but nothing really generic came out. And then all of the big breakthroughs sort of just piled on us around 2016. We've been working on speech recognition since the 1950s, automatic speech recognition. In early 2016, Siri's automatic speech recognition was a joke. And then sometime around October 2016, this article came out. For the first time in known history, an AI was better than human beings at recognizing speech on a specific speech task, switchboard. So here's the article: Microsoft AI beats humans at speech recognition, October 2016. This was the first time it happened, and this happened because now they began using neural networks. Here's another one. Again, in early 2016 or even mid 2016, Google Translate, which was the best translation system out there, arguably, was mostly a party trick. You know, you get together in parties, you'd say something and type something in English and ask you to translate it to Spanish, then translate the Spanish back to English, and then you'd all laugh merrily at the rubbish that came out. That's all it was good for. And then around October 2016 again, suddenly it became so good. This was November 15, 2016. It became so good that now suddenly professional translators were using Google Translate to do the first cut. What happened? They began using neural networks. Or again, games. Now, for the longest time, our metric for what was intelligent, our standard, was thought games like chess and Go. So there were some early naysayers who said AI could never outperform a human in chess. But then in the early 90s, eventually automatic chess game was created that for the first time beat a human grandmaster. Anybody know where that was built?
IBM.
The first chess game to beat a human grandmaster, that was right here in CMU. So it was called Deep Thought. It was somebody's PhD thesis. And then it beat a grandmaster. The person who created it then went on to IBM. And he built Deep Blue, which actually beat Garry Kasparov. So yeah, 1996, chess is beaten. A human expert never beat the best chess game again. But then we had something much more complicated, Go. So it turns out that chess has something like 10 raised to 128 states. Go has 10 raised to 160. So we figured that computers are never going to beat human in Go. You know, Go really requires intelligence. And then guess when an automatic system first beat the human champion? 2016. This was AlphaGo. And today, of course, you have programs you can just download off the web, and it can begin playing with itself, and it can train itself to be so good that it will beat AlphaGo in a few hours, right on your computer. And all this is happening because we're using neural networks. Amazing, huh? And so on. So here's one, right? This was the first example of someone automatically captioning images, also in 2016. Man in black shirt is playing a guitar. This is an automatically generated caption by a system which just analyzed this picture. And it's right? Construction worker in orange safety vest is working on road. Two young girls are playing with a Lego toy. Well, maybe this is not a young girl, but it got it mostly right? Boy is doing backflip on wakeboard. Man in blue wetsuit is surfing on wave. I mean, it's amazing. This was in 2016. This was the first time we saw that a computer program could automatically caption images with such accuracy. And that was because they were using neural networks. And just going on now, here's a little test that Karanveer Singh, one of our TAs from a few years ago, tried. He took a picture of himself and his home, posted it on ChatGPT and said, ChatGPT, tell me about this picture. And it began telling him things he had never noticed. It says the ceiling in the photo appears to have several noticeable water stains, which could indicate potential water damage. It says there are posters on the wall. It describes the furniture, describes the lighting and ventilation. The ceiling has a light fixture and an air vent. This is a standard room with typical building amenities. It's described just from this much, it's describing the bed and bedding. And the overall condition appears somewhat cluttered with personal belongings spread out. Amazing, right? Again, thank you, neural networks. So here's where we are. They're everywhere, from astronomy to healthcare, predicting stock markets, and they're doing an amazing job. So what are these neural networks? In each case, the neural network is some box into which some input goes in and something comes out. Like a voice signal might go in and the transcription would come out if it were performing speech recognition. Or an image goes in and a caption comes out. Or a game state goes in and a suggestion for the next move comes out. So the box basically takes in these inputs and generates these outputs. But really, what's in these boxes? Now, to understand what's in these boxes, we have to go back and understand that each of these tasks, recognizing speech, captioning images, playing games, these are intelligent tasks which in the natural world are powered by this, the human brain. So if we want to understand how to perform these tasks, maybe we should just begin by understanding the human brain, right? And even before the human brain, we want to understand this business of cognition. What is cognition? So this act of thinking, that's something we would like to understand. Here are all the things humans can do. We can learn. We can solve problems. We can recognize patterns. We can create. And here's the best part. You can just be having a shower and thinking with no additional input at all. And you can come up with lovely things. You can cogitate. You can generate stuff spontaneously, right? So all of these are amazing capabilities that we would like to emulate artificially. But to do this, we need to understand how humans work. And how do we work? The problem is, if the brain was simple enough to be understood, we'd be too simple to understand it, as Marvin Minsky said. But that has never stopped us. So we always tackle problems which are bigger than ourselves, and we have tried. And we have been trying for, believe it or not, well over 2,000 years. The first model for how the brain works was proposed by Plato. Does anybody recognize this picture? This one here?
School of Athens.
It's the School of Athens. You can see this in the Sistine Chapel. And every time I see this, it shows all the scientific greats as recognized by the Western world around the 15th century in one painting. It's a lovely painting. I think this is Socrates. I think this is Aristotle, Diogenes, and so on. So anyway, and Plato was one of these. And he was the first person to actually, first recorded person, because almost certainly there have been discussions before him, to have discussed what is, or tried to analyze and come up with a theory for how the human brain works. And his model was called associationism. So what is associationism? We're familiar with this, right? We are all familiar with Ivan Pavlov's experiment with dogs, where he would feed a dog and ring a bell. And then eventually, every time he rang the bell, the dog would drool, because the dog had formed an association between food and the sound of the bell. So the idea behind associationism is that the brain operates through forming these associations. And in fact, this idea was persisted for almost 2,300 years. starting from Plato until Ivan Pavlov in the 20th century. Now, again, how do associations work? Think of lightning. Every time you see a lightning, you generally hear a thunder. After a while, you form an association. So later, when you see a lightning, you begin to expect thunder. You say, hey, here's a bolt of lightning. We're going to hear thunder. Or alternately, you might hear the thunder, and then you're going to think, lightning just struck somewhere near me. You formed an association. And it turns out that this kind of association between percepts is basically how machines work till today. So the idea itself is beautiful and very powerful. But then that doesn't explain everything, right? We know we form associations, but then where are these associations stored? And how are they stored? For this, again, clearly they're stored in the brain. This was not something that was obvious to people for the longest time. The idea that thought and intelligence lies in the brain is a fairly recent phenomenon, a recent bit of knowledge. But that was kind of understood by the 18th century. And in the mid-1800s, we got very powerful microscopes, which actually told us what the brain was constructed of, how it was constructed. We knew that it was a mass of interconnected cells, and these cells were given the name neuron not long afterwards. And so here's what the brain looks like. Lots of neurons. Each neuron has incoming connections from many neurons. Each neuron connects out to many neurons. And so the brain is a network of neurons. But then how does this network actually allow us to store those associations and form inferences? For that, here's the answer to my earlier question. The first person who came up with a model for how the brain works was this guy, Alexander Bain, who was a philosopher, psychologist, mathematician, logician, linguist, and a professor. Back in those days, if you were one thing, you were all of them. And unlike today, it was not easy to be a professor. It was really hard. And he was a professor. And he came up with the first model that the information is stored in the connections in the brain. This was in his book, Mind and Body, written in 1873. And so here's how he tried to explain it. Believe it or not, the first artificial neural network model dates back to 1873. How many years ago was that? Anyone? What would that answer be? 152, right? 150 years. More than 150 years is how old it is. And so here are some models. Yes. Okay. Can you just here are some examples of how he tried to explain things. He said neurons excite and stimulate each other, and so that the manner in which the brain operates and how it stores percepts is all in how they are connected. These neurons are connected. And he hypothesized that even for a fixed connection, different combinations of inputs can result in different outputs, which allows for different kinds of associations to be recalled by the same network. So here, for example, here's a network of 6 neurons. And let's assume that all of the inputs are 0, 1, right? If A and B are high, that is, if they fire, X fires. If A and C fire, then Z fires. If B and C fire, Y fires. So it's the same network, but for different combinations of inputs, different outputs are obtained. Or here's another circuit where there's a single network, but depending on the strength of the input, the output patterns can be different. X, for instance, receives 2 copies of the input with a short delay. Y receives 3 copies with a much longer delay. And so, one second. Sorry about that. I'm just asking my family to quiet down a bit. Okay, so here's a circuit where, a single circuit produces different outputs depending on the strength of the input. Now, this seems like an obvious thing to us these days, that you can have a singles network, a single function that generates different outputs for different inputs. But in the 19th century, this was somewhat of an anathema. And Bain even proposed a learning mechanism. He said when two impressions concur or closely succeed one another, the nerve currents find some bridge or place of continuity according to the abundance of nerve matter available for the transition. He was predicting Hebbian learning. So obviously, very powerful ideas. But the problem was that people mocked him, they doubted him back in the 1870s. These ideas, which seem so obvious to us, were outlandish, and eventually they managed to convince him that he was wrong. So as Bertrand Russell says, the fundamental cause of the trouble is that in the modern world, the stupid are cocksure, while the intelligent are full of doubt. And so in 1873, he postulated that there must be 1 million neurons and 5 billion connections that are required to obtain 200,000 acquisitions. Then after a lot of thought, in 10 years, he realized that you don't always have complete acquisitions. You have to go through the process of building them up. And at any given time, you will have partially formed associations. And so you're going to need neurons to store those too. And eventually, he figured by 1903 that no, this idea doesn't work. The brain would need too many neurons and connections for it to work this way. And so he recanted all his ideas, apologized to all of his colleagues, and then died. As it turns out, his colleagues were wrong. He was right. And the human brain is a connectionist machine, a machine which is composed of lots of simple units, and the information lies in the manner in which these units are connected. Neurons connect to other neurons. The processing capacity of the brains is a function of these connections, so connectionist machines emulate the structure. And so here is what a connectionist machine looks like. It's a network of processing elements, very simple elements, and all world knowledge is stored in the connections between elements. And this is fundamentally different from the kind of computers that you have today. So does anybody know the architecture of the modern computer processor? What is the architecture, anyone? What's the architecture of the processor on your phone? It's a von Neumann, right? What distinguishes the von Neumann architecture? What's special about it? What's special about the von Neumann architecture? How does it work? Anybody?
You have separate processing and data.
You separate out the processor from the memory, right? You have variants on it called the Princeton machine architecture and the Harvard architecture. But the big key idea is this, that you have a processor, and you have memory. The programs and data live in the memory. And the same processor can perform different things by running different programs. So you can use the same processor to do all kinds of different tasks simply by changing the program in the memory, which is what makes your phone or your laptop or your supercomputer so powerful. You have the same computer which can do all kinds of things. In a connectionist machine, this is not true. The program lies in the connection between the units. So the computer is the program. If you want to change the program, you have to change the computer itself, which is why we never actually build physical neural networks. We emulate them on a von Neumann machine. And so to recap, neural network-based AI has taken over most AI tasks. These originally began as computational models of the brain, or more generally as models of cognition. The earliest model of cognition was associationism, and the more recent model is connectionist, where neurons connect to neurons, and the workings of the brain are encoded in these connections. Current neural network models are connectionist machines. And so we have our first poll. You're all going to pretend that you didn't see what just popped up. And we will release our first poll. Can you see the poll?
Yes.
Yeah. There are two questions on the poll. Okay. 10 seconds, guys. Aditya, the poll should be showing up on your screen if you're on Zoom. This sometimes happens. Okay. So let me stop, right? I'll end the poll and share the results. Can you see the answers? Okay, I'll just stop sharing and let's look at this. First question, what is the answer, everybody? Bain, right? Second question, I didn't actually give you the answer to this question. I usually do that during the lecture, but today I decided to, let you guys guess. Roughly how many connections exist between neurons in the brain? 100 trillion, right? It turns out that, Alexander Bain's assumption that we do not have enough connections did not hold water. He thought there just weren't, 5 billion connections and 1 million neurons were too many. No, we actually have 80 billion neurons in this little head of ours and 100 trillion connections. And so that's why we are able to store all of these percepts. Now to answer the Rishabh, we will get to that. How do connections explain associationism? Associations are about patterns. One pattern triggers another pattern. And so we're going to need models to explain that, right? So here's where we are. Connectionist machines. No, Aditya, you don't. Connectionist machines are networks of processing elements. All world knowledge is stored in the connections between them. Now, these elements, what are these elements? For that, we're going to go back to the brain. So the basic elements in the brain are neurons. And here's what a neuron looks like. It's got a big head called the soma with lots of these little tendrils, which are called dendrites, through which signals come in from other neurons. If the total signal coming into the neuron exceeds some threshold, it fires, roughly speaking. And then that signal travels down this long arm and goes to other neurons. This long arm over here is called the axon. This is the most important part of the neuron because it's so long. And so it's protected by this sheath called the myelin sheath, which is made of fat. And so because neurons and the brain's capacity lies in the connections between neurons. Neurons cannot split. If they split, the connections would break down. So neurons do not undergo cell division. The brains you have now are all the brains you're going to have, more or less. And then, secondly, it turns out that this fat that protects the axons, this long leg, that's the most important part too. So it turns out that having more neurons in your head doesn't explain intelligence. Having more fat glial cells to protect these neurons explains more intelligence. So somebody actually stored a bit of Einstein's brain and they tried to study it to see how it was different, and they found he had more fat in his head than most people. So actually being a fat head is a compliment because it means you're smarter than others. Anyway, so we need models, right? So here, the first model for the neurons came from these two guys, McCullough and Pitts. Warren McCullough was a neurophysicist. Walter Pitts was a homeless guy who knocked on McCullough's door, and somehow McCullough let him in, and they worked on this crazy problem. So anybody want to guess which is McCullough and which is Pitts? Over here? Anyone?
First one, Pitts.
The first one is Pitts. Yeah. So this is Warren McCullough. Obviously, he's the prop for the wine. And Walter Pitts was very young. He was about 20 years old, 90 years old when he ended up in McCullough's door. So they came up with this model called the mathematical model for the neuron. And for the first time, we had a mathematical model for parts of the brain, units of the brain. And they introduced this notion that that the brain can be modeled as performing propositional logic, where each neuron evaluates the truth value of its inputs. It evaluates propositions. effectively, this is Boolean logic plus a little more. So they focused on the Boolean aspect of it. And here's how they explained it. They say the neurons connect to other neurons through two kinds of connections. These are the excitatory synapses. The synapses are how neurons connect to one another, and inhibitory synapses. So signals come in through the excitatory synapse. If the total signal exceeds a threshold, the neuron fires, unless there's a signal through the inhibitory synapse. If there's any signal coming down the inhibitory synapse, the neuron will no longer fire. So here are some examples. Here, in each case, you must assume that if there are two or more inputs, the neuron will fire. Here's one. If neuron 1 fires, neuron 2 receives 2 inputs, which matches the threshold, it will fire. So this is just a delay. What is this one? What kind of Boolean operation will this perform? Anyone? That's an OR, right? If either 1 or 2 fire, this receives 2 inputs and it will fire. What about this? That's an AND, right? And what about the one on the right? This is a crazier one. 1 must fire and 2 must not fire. So it's 1 and not 2. So it's more complex. It's not an XOR, it's 1 and not 2 specifically, right? And then they also showed that you can come up with even more complicated logic. Here, for example, if you're trying to model sensations and sensations of heat and cold, it's a well-known fact that if you touch a cold object for a very short period of time, your first sensation is heat. It's only extended exposure that gives you a sensation of cold. So focus on the cold receptor. If you're touching a cold object and you just touched it very briefly, at the very first instant, you'd get a cold response here, but then the second input is coming through this delay. And so since you get only one response, you're not going to feel cold. On the other hand, if you touch cold very shortly, this guy will fire after 1 time instant. That causes this guy to fire after 2 time instants. That causes the heat sensation to fire. So if you touch cold very briefly, you'll feel heat. But if you have extended exposure, then by the second instant, this guy continues to fire, and this inhibitory synapse will block this neuron, and you no longer feel heat. On the other hand, down here, you're going to get one signal from here, you're going to get a delayed signal from here, and you will feel cold. So this very simple model could actually explain some pretty complicated phenomena. So they claimed all sorts of things about their model. They said their models should be able to compute a class of functions, that if a tape is provided, it can compute a richer class of functions that are equivalent to Turing machines, all of which is true. They didn't have many strong results of their own, but most importantly, they didn't provide a learning mechanism. For that, how does the brain learn its connections? For that, they had to wait for this guy, Donald Hebb, who wrote this book called Organization of Behavior in 1949. Like all the scientists of the day, he was another eccentric person who started life as a novelist, then became a farmer, then became a hobo, then a school teacher, then finally gave it all up and joined Harvard and became a psychologist. And he proposed a learning mechanism, which he explained in this very crazy text, which people, when an axon of cell A is near enough to excite cell B, and repeatedly or persistently takes part in firing it, some growth process or metabolic change takes place, such that A's efficiency as one of the cells firing B is increased. Now, it sounds complex, but roughly speaking, we like to summarize it as neurons that fire together, wire together. How does that work? Now, when you have 2 neurons connecting, they don't actually touch one another. The first neuron has an axonal connection, which is this bulb. And anytime the first neuron fires, some chemicals are emitted from here, which cause the second neuron to fire. And if the connection of the if the excitation of the first neuron causes the second neuron to fire, then the resulting effect is to make this bulb slightly larger, which means that the connection becomes stronger. So a mathematical model for this is that the weight of the connections between 2 neurons, WXY, is always going to be incremented by X times Y. If both X and Y fire, then W increases. This is called the Hebbian rule. And it's a very powerful idea. It's actually the basis of many learning algorithms in machine learning. But it has a fatal problem. What is that? Anybody? What's the problem with this one? It doesn't decrease, right? It always keeps increasing. So it's fundamentally unstable. Stronger connections will keep enforcing themselves. There's no notion of competition. Eventually, if you wait long enough, all of the weights are going to be so high that the network is not going to be doing anything useful. And so people try to fix this. They came up with all kinds of updates like the generalized Hebbian rule and so on. But it wasn't really a solution till something happened. But before that, here's our second poll. Let me release the second poll. Can you folks see the poll? Okay, 10 seconds, guys. Everybody's got it.
Are these the polls that determine attendance?
Yes, unless you have some issues with the polls, right? Okay. All right, let me stop the poll. 45 seconds. Share results. Now, let me stop sharing. What is the answer, guys? Anybody? Number 2, right? Perfect.
Yeah.
So here we are. But then, so Hebbian learning has a problem. And the solution to that came from this guy, Frank Rosenblatt, who was a logician and a psychologist in Yale. And he invented what we now know as the perceptron, although his perceptron was more complex than what we are familiar with. He was trying to explain human vision. And so here was his model. He said that sensors from the retina excited a layer of neurons in something called the A1 area, the projection area, and these would excite neurons in the association area, and then these would finally excite your responses. It was a pretty complicated model and had many units, but the basic unit, which can at some level be simplified to this. You have the sensory units, and then you have the associative layer, where each neuron receives inputs from many sensors and responds to it. And then these associative layer neurons then trigger the response neurons. So the individual neurons themselves over here had this kind of structure. They received many inputs. Corresponding to each input was a weight. If the weighted sum of all inputs exceeded some threshold, the neuron would fire. It would output a 1. Otherwise, it would output a 0. So Zian, unbounded meanings it can just keep increasing until it saturates and cannot. So there's no cap to it, right? Anyway, so here it is. The weighted sum of inputs, if it exceeds a threshold, it will fire, otherwise it will not. So I can also state it like so. If the weighted sum of inputs minus a threshold is positive, the unit will fire, otherwise it will not. Is this making sense, this figure? This simple explanation? Yes, no? Okay. All right. And so here's where we are, right? Now, originally, this was the model that Rosenblatt was pitching. The units of the model were this guy, this simple perceptron. And Rosenblatt's original model was pretty powerful if it became large enough. So it was originally assumed that it could represent any Boolean circuit and perform any logic. So you had these, glowing news articles like the embryo of an electronic computer that the Navy expects will be able to walk, talk, see, reproduce itself, and be conscious of its existence. Frankenstein monster designed by Navy that thinks. This was all in 1958. They overstated the capability of this simple perceptron so much that Rosenblatt couldn't match it, and research funding dried up for a decade. But then more importantly, on the researcher end, although this is, this larger model is roughly, is at some level infinitely capable, they began making the same assumption about the individual units in the model. And that's where things really fail. Now, Rosenblatt actually didn't just introduce the perceptron. He also introduced a learning rule for these guys. And the learning rule was very similar to the Hebbian learning rule with one difference. In the Hebbian learning rule, there's no notion of a target. If X and Y fire, the weight goes up. Here he introduced the notion of supervision and a target. So every neuron had a target. And so anytime there was an error between the target of the neuron and the actual output of the neuron, then the weight was updated in proportion to both the error and the input. If the neuron was doing the right thing, it would not get updated. And this simple update rule, he actually proved that even the simple units can give you perfect answers for linearly separable classes. Now, here again is the neuron, right? You have many inputs. You compute a weighted sum of the inputs. If it exceeds a threshold or matches it, it fires. You can see that even that simple unit is very powerful. So here are examples of perceptrons where I'm assuming that the threshold, the value inside the circle is the threshold. The value about the arrows are the weights. If the perceptron has a, if the total input matches the threshold, the perceptron will fire. Can anybody tell me what this perceptron is? That's an AND, right? So if both X and Y fire, the total input is 2. This is an AND. What about this guy? What is this one? If either X or Y fire, the total input is 1. It's an OR, right? What about this one? It's an OR, right? If X is 1, the total input is -1. It won't fire. If X is 0, the total input is 0. It will fire. So, even the simple unit is very powerful. It can model any Boolean operation, but there's no setting for these weights that can actually create an XOR. And so once this realization struck in, then people sort of got stuck on this problem, and research in the area stalled for a while. But then the answer was already available. You want to network them. Individual elements are weak computational elements. You need to network them. Now go back and consider the brain. The brain is not just one neuron. It has many neurons which are connected to one another. And so once you begin connecting neurons to each other, all kinds of things are possible. Here, for example, is the XOR. This cannot be done by a single perceptron. But in this example, I've connected up 3 perceptrons. This one computes X or Y. This computes not X or not Y. And this one ANDs these 2 outputs, and the result is going to be an XOR of X and Y. Now, observe that you're not interested in the outputs of these individual neurons, only on the input of the output of this guy. So this is called the output neuron. Although these need not necessarily be hidden, the fact that their individual outputs are not of particular interest, specific interest to you, means that even if they were hidden, it wouldn't matter. So we call them the hidden layer. So this is the hidden layer, and this is the output. And what we find is that by networking up neurons, now we can compute an XOR. In fact, you can compute any Boolean function once you begin networking neurons. So here is a pretty complicated Boolean function of 4 inputs. And simply by connecting up the perceptrons in this manner, you can compute this Boolean function. So what this means is that a network of perceptrons can compose arbitrarily complicated Boolean functions. In cognitive terms, it means that they can compute arbitrary Boolean functions over sensory input. And so perceptrons, this is what we will now call a multi-layer perceptron. You have more than one perceptron. They are connected up in a network, and the perceptrons themselves are arranged in layers. What is a layer? We'll get a formal definition of this in the next class, but you can visually observe that there are layers. So this is a multi-layer perceptron, and what we find is that multi-layer perceptrons can compose any Boolean function. And so here is the story so far. Neural networks began as computational models of the brain. They're connectionist machines. They comprise networks of neural units. And the first computational model for the neurons was the McCullough and Pitts model, where neurons act as Boolean threshold units. And this models the brain is performing for propositional logic. The first learning rule was Hebb's learning rule. Neurons that fire together, wire together, it's unstable. And Rosenblatt's perceptron was a variant of the McCullough and Pitt neuron with a provably convergent learning rule. But then the individual units are limited in their capacity. But if you connect up Rosenblatt's perceptrons into multi-layer networks, they can model arbitrarily complex Boolean functions. Questions? Any questions? No? Okay. So, before I continue then, is our brain Boolean? Are we only performing Boolean logic? No, right? Why not? So are the inputs we receive Boolean? Clearly not, right? We have real valued inputs. We also make non-Boolean inferences and predictions, right? Things are analog. So how can this model work on this kind of input and output? Let's see. Let's go back to the perceptron, but now let's consider that these inputs are real valued. X1 through Xn are real valued. The weights are also real valued. It still operates the same way. It obtains a weighted sum of inputs. If this weighted sum exceeds a threshold, it fires. The output is Boolean, otherwise it doesn't fire. What kind of function will this be? Anybody want to guess? What kind of function would this be? So here's what it's going to look like, right? What is the boundary between the inputs where the output is 1 and where the output is 0? The boundary is where the summation of the inputs is exactly equal to the threshold, right? So in other words, the boundary between when the output is 1 and where the output is 0 is given by summation wi xi equals t. Now, before that, I want to introduce a notion of how this model can be restated. I can say this differently. I can say that I am first computing a weighted sum of inputs plus a bias. So this, in other words, you first compute an affine function of the inputs, and this affine value is now put through a threshold function and what is called an activation, where the threshold activation outputs are 1 if the input is positive and 0 otherwise, right? Now, and so does anybody know the difference between affine and linear? Anyone? The bias, right? So just we'll get back to that in the next class. But here's what the perceptron looks like. It first computes a weighted sum plus a bias of the input. That's the affine. And let me see if I can mark this up. If I have, if I consider two axes, a function of this kind is a line, but it's not going through origin, right? So this is affine. But if this goes, if a line goes through origin, this is linear. That's the basic definition of the affine versus linear. And so first you compute an affine value of the inputs, and then you put it through a threshold activation. How do I erase this thing? Can I erase it? Okay. So that's what we do, right? And let's see how this operates, right? Now, but once you redraw it like this, you can do other kinds of things. You can compute an affine function and put it through all kinds of activations besides the threshold, like this smooth threshold, which is called a sigmoid, or something like this, which is called this is a rectification function, also called a rectified linear unit. This is the smooth version of it called the soft plus, and so on. So just this simple modification allows us to do different things. But anyway, for now, let's continue assuming the threshold activation, okay? How does this function behave? The boundary between when the output is 1 and when the output is 0 is when the weighted sum of inputs is exactly equal to the threshold. This is the equation of a hyperplane, correct? When the weighted sum of inputs x matches a threshold, that's the equation, that's an affine equation, an equation of a plane of this kind, right? Yes or no? And so what we have is this. There is this boundary where the weighted sum of inputs exactly equals the threshold. For all inputs on one side of this boundary, the output is 0. On all inputs on the other side, the output is 1. So the function, this perceptron itself models this Heaviside function or step function where there's a linear boundary, where on one side the output is 1, on the other side the output is 0. And now you can see why a perceptron can be a different Boolean gates, right? So when your inputs are Boolean, the inputs, if I have two inputs, the inputs can only be 0, 0, 1, 0, 1, 1, or 0, 1. If I have a perceptron where the boundary between 1 and 0 is this line, what gate did it encode? Right, that's an OR. If it's this line, what gate did it encode? An AND, right? And over here, this one just ignored x2 and it's just not x1, right? So very simple. You can just see how by changing the weights, you can get different Boolean gates. But then once you realize you can do something of this kind, you can do crazier things. So let's say I want to build a network, a multi-layer perceptron, which will output a 1 when the input is inside this pentagon and a 0 outside. How would I do it? I can start off with one perceptron, which captures this lower boundary. It outputs a 0 on this side of the boundary and a 1 above it. A second perceptron captures this boundary. It outputs a 0 here and a 1 on the yellow side. The third perceptron captures this one, right? It outputs a 0 above this line and 1 below it. A fourth one captures this boundary and a fifth one captures this boundary, which is the only region where all 5 perceptrons output a 1. Anybody? Where do all 5 perceptrons output a 1? Inside the pentagon, right? So what more do I need to do to construct a network that outputs a 1 inside the pentagon and 0 outside? And them. I can just AND them, right? And so voila, I have this little network which outputs a 1 inside a pentagon and 0 outside. But once I can do this, I can do crazier things. I can build a network which outputs a 1 if the input is anywhere within this double pentagon and 0 outside. How? One subnet outputs a 1 inside the lower pentagon. The second one outputs a 1 inside the upper pentagon, or the two. And here is this network that will output a 1 within the double pentagon and 0 outside. And yes, Anirudh, lines are more generally. So what do you mean by hyperplane of 3 axes? This is, in this case, yeah. I just have 2 axes. I have 2 inputs. So this one here. So I have 2 inputs. The word third axis is 1. So this is the line which separates the region between the 1 and the 0. The output is 0 on this side and 1 on the other side. Did that answer your question, Shiva? Right, so here we are. And now, of course, Now I can construct other kinds of crazy complex decision boundaries. I just have to decompose it like so. I can build pretty much any decision boundary that I want, right? Amazing. And so when you think of classification problems, inputs live in some high dimensional space. For example, if you're classifying digits, this is an example from MNIST. This thing has 780, it's a 784 pixel image. It's essentially an input in a 784 dimensional space. In that space, there's some region within which all the twos lie. And so if I want to build a network that can recognize twos, I just have to use this simple theory to build a network that isolates the region within this region which I've shown as a peanut over here. And that will output a 1 for inputs inside that region and 0 outside. And now I have a 2 classifier. And in fact, I can model any decision boundary in this manner. Therefore, MLPs can classify any real valued input. You give me a decision boundary, I can build an MLP that approximates it to arbitrary precision by composing it from hyperplanes. So MLPs are universal classifiers. Did this make sense? Yes or no? That makes sense, guys? Okay, fantastic. And so the story so far, MLPs are connectionist computational models. So Luca will get to that, right? So in a minute, MLPs are connectionist computational models. Individual perceptrons are computational equivalent of neurons. And the MLP is a layered composition of many such, multi-layered perceptron is a layered composition of many such perceptrons. They can model any Boolean function. Individual perceptrons can act as Boolean gates. Networks can be Boolean functions. So MLPs are universal Boolean functions. They can model any Boolean function. They can model any decision boundary. Individual perceptrons capture linear boundaries. Complex boundaries can be composed from the linear boundaries. So which means MLPs can represent arbitrary decision boundaries, so they can be used to classify data. In other words, they are not universal Boolean machines. They can compose any Boolean function. They're universal classifiers. They can compose any classification boundary. So here is my third poll. And let's see. Okay, I'm giving you only 40 seconds for this, guys. Ten seconds. All right. Okay. So here's how you have replied. Does anybody want to give me the answer? What is the answer? Anyone? It's 7. You're going to need 6 for each of the sides of the polygon and a 7th to AND them all, right? It's not 6, it's 7. Perfect. Thank you, guys. 7 is the correct answer. But then that's only for classification. And classification over real valued inputs. But what about continuous valued outputs? Classification has categorical or Boolean outputs, even though the input is real valued. But functions can also have real valued outputs. How do you do that? So I'm going to explain this using a simple function of a scalar input, a scalar output of a scalar input. This function, we want to take a single x and compute a function of it. First, I'm going to compute this circuit, this network. This perceptron fires if x exceeds the input threshold T1. This perceptron fires if it exceeds the threshold T2. So what happens is x goes from -infinity to +infinity. So long as x is below T1, both of them output 0. The net output is 0. If x exceeds T1, assume T1 is lesser than T2, right? Then this neuron begins outputting a 1, And then this neuron continues to output a 0. And so the total output here is going to be 1. As x continues to increase, eventually it will exceed t2. At that point, this one will also output a 1, and these two will cancel each other because their weights are 1 and -1 respectively. And the output goes back to 0. So this little network outputs a 1 between t1 and t2 and 0 everywhere else. This making sense to you guys? Yes, no? Right. And anybody want to tell me how I can model an arbitrary function with this? How would I model this, an arbitrary function with this? Anyone? Here's what I can do, right? Let's say I have this crazy function. As Arnav says, I can just have little subnets, one for each region. I can split the axis into little regions. I can have one little subnet within each region, each outputting a 1 within that region. I can scale all of these to different heights and add them up. And voila, I have a network exactly which models this net function, approximates this function as a piecewise constant. And I can make the approximation error arbitrarily small by making these rectangles arbitrarily narrow, right? So this is how I can model a function, continuous valued function to arbitrary precision. And this generalizes to functions of any number of inputs. We'll see how in the next class. But the upshot of this is that an MLP can model a continuous valued regression. So I'm not going to post this poll, but does anybody want to answer this question? How many neurons will be required by a network of sinusoidal activation neurons to precisely model y equals cos 2x? Remember, I can replace the threshold activation with anything. Here I've replaced it with sine. Right? How many will I need? The answer is 1, right? Because I can just say that the weight is 2 and the bias is pi over 2. So you're going to end up with sine of 2x plus pi over 2, which is cos of 2x. So this is going to be 1. Right? So none of the above is the correct answer. Anyway.
Sir, x and z were same functions there?
Pardon me?
Were x and z same functions there, or they were different functions? I mean, sine z.
I just want a network for y equals sine of z, right? And then instead, so the activation is a sine activation. You have the weight and the bias, right? That's all.
Okay.
So in any case, what this means is that the MLP can also model continuous valued functions. In other words, MLPs can do everything. They can model Boolean functions, they can model classification functions, they can model continuous valued functions, they can do other kinds of things. So far, we've seen networks where information flows in one direction. If I begin adding loops, it turns out they can remember patterns. This was proposed by Lawrence Kuby in 1930, and it's very popular even today. They can represent probability distributions over integer and real valued and complex valued domains. They can model a posteriori and a priori probabilities. They can generate data from complicated or even unknown distributions. They can do pretty much everything. I like to joke that, they can rub their stomachs and pat their heads at the same time. I thought I was joking. And then I found that there are actually competitions for this sort of thing. And the guy who wins it is usually an Indian. So anyway, and so the network is a function. Given an input, it computes the function layer-wise to predict the output. More generally, given one or more inputs, it predicts one or more outputs. And so here, what's in these boxes? Each of these boxes is a function. It's taking an input and generating an output, right? So we replace them with neural networks. It can be approximated to arbitrary precision by a neural network. And so here's our story so far. Multi-layer perceptrons are connectionist computational models. They are classification engines. They can also model continuous valued functions. Interesting AI tasks are functions that can be modeled by the network. And so to come to an end, We've gone through a brief history of neural networks, its relation to cognition in the brain. We've seen some early models and their limitations. We've introduced modern neural networks and what they can compute. So in the next class, we'll look at more on how these are universal approximators and what do we mean by the depth of a network and how does it relate to its capacity. So I'll stop right here and I'll take some questions. Any questions? I saw that okay. You didn't get, how did we model the graph? Okay, this, are you speaking of this one here? Ibrahim? Is this the one? Yeah, okay. This network to the left can produce an output of 1 between T1 and T2, correct? Yes? Okay, so here's what I can do. I can have one little subnet of 2 neurons, which with this as T1 and this as T2. A second subnet of 2 neurons with this as T1 and this as T2, and so on. So for each pair of boundaries, I can have one subnet. And so each of these subnets is going to output a 1 in a different region. Now that output can be scaled by the target height of the function within that region. Does that make sense? And then the whole thing can be added. And so that's how we approximate this function. Okay. Rishabh, that's for later, right? Any other questions? Any other questions? So this week, Saturday's lab is also a recitation because I will be having a class on Friday. Monday is a holiday. So I'm going to use the Friday slot to cover lecture 3. And because we need to have a certain amount of material completed by the second week to release our homework sometime. And the lab is shifted to the Saturday hackathon. It will be recorded and it will be put up. Any other questions? Any questions about today's lecture? Is everything clear? So Dhruv, you can just check those on the course website. Was today's lecture clear? If do me a favor, everybody give me a thumbs up if you found it was clear, and then I can log on. Right, I'd like to count like 100 or so thumbs up. I just got 2. Okay.
Sir, I had a question.
Yes, go ahead.
Sir, while we were modeling Boolean functions using MLPs, we were actually varying the weights, for modeling functions like AND or XOR, right? What if we vary the thresholds?
So let me go here. So in these simple, okay, first, when I was, where am I going there? This one. If I look at this perceptron, the weights are all always 1 and -1, right? So here it's fairly simple, correct? It's only when you begin looking at it more along these lines that you can think of them as generic weights and thresholds. It doesn't matter what your weight and threshold is, so long as my perceptron has a boundary which falls between this one and the line that connects these two guys. This is going to be an OR. So long as my perceptron has a boundary which falls in this region, it's going to be an AND. And so you have many options for weights and thresholds. That makes sense?
Yes, sir.
Any other questions?
I have a question.
Yeah.
Like when we say that we can like model continuous valued functions using piecewise linear functions with arbitrary precision, isn't it over a finite domain of input? Like if like x cannot be over like any domain because functions can be arbitrarily complex.
You're absolutely right. All we are speaking of is the capacity of the network to model functions. If you give me a large enough network, I can model the function to, arbitrary precision over most of the domain, right? If you want to model it infinite over the entire infinite space, you need infinite neurons. We are not speaking of limitations yet, only the capacity of the function, right?
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
And now this one here, So I can say cos 2x is sine of 2x plus pi over 2, correct?
Yes.
And so that's the same as saying that I have a perceptron with one input, right? One input. This weight is 2, and this bias is pi over 2, and the activation is sine.
Yes.
Yeah. Anything else? All right, guys. Thank you very much. Thanks for your patience. And I will stop the recording.